We amass information as best we can from as many sources as we're aware of. But what we then do with that information is crucial. Here, I want to talk about prioritizing risks as part of how we evaluate information, which leads to prioritizing decisions and actions, what it is the person wants, or we're going to focus our immediate attention on. This image is taken from the Mastering Risk publication in 2000 from the Financial Times. It sets out quadrants related to the relative likelihood and impact of a risk as part of how we evaluate its priority for attention. Priorities then pan out on this ABCD list to see what level of attention we may afford to a particular risk. If you'll allow me to start with quadrant B, this is where we see potential high impact and low likelihood, which would suggest we should afford a high priority in terms of attention. Yes, the high impact is what's going to concern us, even though there's only a low likelihood. If it does happen, it's going to have a major impact in terms of its outcome on people. Though our highest priority should be quadrant A, high impact and high likelihood, and I'm sure that speaks pretty much for itself. How might you respond to quadrant C? There is clearly going to be a high likelihood of the risk occurring, but the impact remains low. We still need to pay attention, but the magnitude of the impact might not draw us in and concern us quite so much. Even with quadrant D, a low impact and low likelihood, we're still talking about risks. We don't ignore them, but clearly, in our order of priorities, that would take a lower level. So this is a rough and ready subjective approach to evaluating risks, but it is at least a tool for helping us to prioritise when our resources are finite, but the competing demands of different risks still requires our attention. Then again, how do we respond to each of these categories? The high impact and high likelihood risk clearly requires immediate action. The high impact but low likelihood risk needs a contingency plan, something in place, a rapid response as and when needed. The low impact and high likelihood risk needs constant consideration. Action should be considered as and when these particular priorities emerge. And then the low impact, low likelihood risk, these remain as actual risks and shouldn't be ignored, but they are more likely to require just that periodic review, continuing to be aware of the potential for a risk to happen. Ultimately, risk assessment is about informing the decisions that we have to make. Decisions, it's all about decisions. But thinking in ways that are too black and white about being right or wrong can only serve to probably make us unnecessarily more risk averse. Is there really a right way or a wrong way? No, there isn't such a clear distinction in much of what we do. Again, I want to come back to clearly stating that risk-averse decisions are good decisions if they're clearly thought out and reasoned. However, they're not good decisions if they're purely the result of fear and defensiveness. Ultimately, it is about taking things on a decision-by-decision basis, taking into account the context of the information rather than seeing everything as either a right or a wrong way. We see a risk assessment is all about information. I've mentioned that many times. I keep repeating this message. It's all about information throughout these presentations, but it does bear repeating. Figures tell us something, going back to the actuarial approaches, but treat them with caution. Remember that next point. It's all about the situational context, the individual triggers carefully constructed, succinct narrative accounts. These are what communicate the quality information. The figures, the broader pictures from the research, the evidence base, they can inform things, but you're not dealing with a large group of people, as is the case with most research studies. You are usually, as let's say practitioners, or even in terms of whatever other business you're involved in, you're focused in on a specific decision or a risk assessment and an evaluation of that information that links to a specific decision. And you need to think about the weight that you give to specific factors. And that will vary dependent from decision to decision and even from time to time. So I need to repeat a statement that I published back in 1998. Published it in a manual that was entitled Assessing and Managing Risk. And I want to share that now because it feels just as pertinent today. Back then, what I said was access information, determine the risk factors, identify the early warning signs, and develop a clear and comprehensive plan of intervention. Prediction could not be simpler, and prevention must surely be the outcome. This assumption relies on good quality assessment tools, but probably also on people remaining consistent in their behaviour patterns. Both of these assumptions are somewhat dangerous to rely on. We know that people are not consistent in their behaviour, even without the experience of mental health problems. It is also safe to say that our current assessment of situations and of the precipitants of incidents is better in hindsight. Now, I said that back in 1998, but I'll let you ponder that statement for a moment or two. And here's an exercise encouraging you to reflect on your management responses to the risks that you've assessed. At this point, I'd like you to read the PDF handout in the resources of this module, simply entitled Risk Management. Then, using the priorities in practice slide earlier in this presentation, firstly, how would you categorize the risks you're routinely working with? And then secondly, what do the 4 types of response that I lay out generally look like in your experience? This idea of immediate action, contingency planning, careful consideration, and review.